Hello, and welcome back to another Breyer customization video. Today's project is a little different because I will be using a stablemate instead of a traditional model. Also, yes, you read that right. Even though Halloween is like 8 months away, it's never too early to make a Kelpie. So I may have accidentally dropped him on the cement floor and broken his leg off. But luckily, this won't matter at all because unlike my last Kelpie, this guy will have a fishtail. I love all the different lore surrounding this myth. And the fishtail Kelpie isn't as common, but I thought it would be perfect for this project. I will be opening his mouth to show off his nice sharp teeth, so first I use the Dremel to carefully cut away the plastic. I am using a respirator and glasses. I'm not cutting it completely off, just enough to move it. Next, I go ahead and cut off the back. I will also be moving this leg, so I cut away any plastic where it will bend into. To bend the leg, I heat it up with my embossing gun. I make sure not to hold it directly on one spot at a time, and instead move it around so that the plastic doesn't bubble. Then I can move it where I want. I dunk it in some ice water to freeze the position. Same thing for the hoof. Now let's take care of the logo, rough spots, and any seams. I use a 240 and then down to a 600 grit sandpaper. Here's the tail armature I made by twisting some wire with my drill. It's actually just some leftover electric fence wire that my dad had laying around. Now this isn't going to be just any old Kelpie. This will be a Carousel Kelpie. So for the pole I will be using this steel rod. You can definitely also use a wood dowel too, but this is a little stronger. I mark where I want it to go and then cut it to the size I need. Drilling 2 holes that have to line up is always really tricky. I did end up using a smaller bit first to make the initial hole, and then use that to guide the bigger bit. And while I have the drill out, I also add smaller holes for the main armature wires to slot into. Next, it's time for sculpting. Using my Aves epoxy, I fill in the area. I smooth that with rubbing alcohol. I make sharp little teeth by rolling a point out of the epoxy and then carefully placing it with my knife. I fill in the front teeth, and now I can make the snarling expression with a new nose. also put in the little carousel bit. I can then attach the noodles into a bridle. While I'm at it, I also fill in where I cut this leg. For the carousel pole, I am holding it in with epoxy. I typically recommend just gluing this first, but since my design will have the main wrapping around the pole, it will be super secure. I also add in the wire for the tail. Once that it all hardened, it's time to start bulking the tail out with some foil. I use hot glue to hold that into place and add more precise filler. Now that I have a base, it's time to add the epoxy. First, I just focus on getting the section covered. Then I can make sure it's smooth with rubbing alcohol. I use my fingers as well as the cuticle tool. For the transition into the scales, I carve in a hair-like texture. Then I add the big scales that go on the underside. Then I can fill in everything else with small scales. I want a fin to be coming off of the top, so I sketch the shape into some aluminum roof flashing. I can just cut it with regular scissors. Just make sure you do wear eye protection. Little metal scraps will fling everywhere. Also, these edges are pretty sharp, so just be careful. I pressed that into the tail while it's still soft, and then later I glued it into place once that had hardened. For the big fin, same deal. I covered everything first with the epoxy. Then once it's all smooth, I can carve in the detail. Even though most people probably won't see it, can't forget the back too. I also use my knife to make little separations at the end. I had some epoxy left over, so I started to work on the mane. You can see where I already glued those wires in and bent them where the mane will flow. I do realize I shaved this forelock down only to add one back over top. Oh well. I add some sides to this fin, not only for strength, but also so it blends into the tail better. With all that hardened, it's time for some fun carousel details. I use a paint pen to figure out a good size for the saddle. Working from underneath first, I lay down the saddle pad by cutting strips from flattened out pieces. I blend it up into the body. I don't quite go all the way up, just to keep it from getting bulky. I decided it was a little too short in the back, so I added on another strip. To keep with the creepy theme, I make the fabric tattered and wrinkly. I also cut out a piece for the saddle. Aw, it kinda looks like a heart. See, this is a Valentine's Day video after all. For the seat, I add a teardrop shape along the back. I add a little piece to hold the back up. I forgot to do the girth, so let's add that really quick, while trying not to mess up the saddle. It will also be getting a fancy breast collar. I add in a few more little details. Now let's get back to that mane. I want it really flowing to look like it's in the water. Just when you thought I couldn't possibly add any more to this, what's a Kelpie without a bunch of seaweed? I attached a bunch of twisted wire so that when I apply the epoxy for the seaweed, it doesn't slide right off. I make sure to add in a lot of different textures and variety. My favorite trick is to flatten a noodle and then gently twist it. You may have noticed the tail has some exposed wire. Since it's such a thin part holding this big fin, I decided to rip off the epoxy and take out the glue and foil underneath. That way it'll just be solid epoxy and much stronger. This is actually a gift, so it does need to survive the journey through the postal service. I decided to cut this top part of the mane off, as well as some of the ends. I love a crazy look, but it was perhaps a little too crazy. So I make sure I sculpt back over those areas as well. And lastly, I add the little ball at the top of the pole. After a quick wash and dry, it's time to prime. This Mr. Surfacer primer is extra great for small models like this, since you don't lose any detail. Technically, I didn't really need to be airbrushing this. It would have been totally fine just hand painting and shading with pastels. But I can't help it, I just really want to use it. For the base, I just use a wood slice that you can get at craft stores. I made sure to cover it with some paper before airbrushing. I'm going for a very muted purple, which for some reason is always the color that gives me the most trouble. Maybe because it's my least favorite color, or maybe that's why it's my least favorite color. So I'm not the most confident in this base layer, but I'm gonna make it work. I do add some darker shading, which helps. After I let that dry and sealed it with matte spray, I can add the shine. I'm not gonna lie, this is what I've been looking forward to doing the most. I got a set of color shifting nail powders that I've been dying to use. I'm just applying it with these little makeup sponges. Oh my gosh, it looks so cool and, oh, okay. I guess that could happen. We'll worry about that later. Anyway, back to the good stuff. I do also add some black pastels to shade before sealing everything again. I was worried that the shine would completely go away with the matte spray, but it stayed better than I thought. I will still need more layers of it though. I also made sure to glue that piece back on with some 2-part glue, so it's not going anywhere now. For everything else, I will be starting with white, so that the colors will show up evenly and bright. I make sure to thin it with some water and do a bunch of layers. While waiting for that to dry, I also add some lighter shades to the body to really help the sculpted details pop. Now I can go in with the colors on the tack. You can really see how it needed that white base, since this paint needs a ton of layers to become opaque when thinned. I also start adding the green to the seaweed. I take a very watery darker shade of green and do a wash to get into all those crevices. I blot it with a cloth to bring out the midtones again. I add in even more highlights with a small brush. It looks intense at first, but the light colors will always dry darker, especially when thinned. Next, I take a light but still pretty dull-toned green to do the highlights of the seaweed. I can just dry brush it on and the details get picked up nicely. I do add in a very faint bright green pupil to the eyes. You don't notice it unless you're really staring into them, which I wouldn't do too long if I were you. And more nail powder because I can't resist. I also go in and shade the tack with eyeshadow. I sealed all that, and now I can add the gloss to make the seaweed appear wet. I also glossed the eyes and teeth. The powder was my favorite part, but adding this silver enamel is a close second. This will make everything really come together. And with all that, it's time for the final result. I think the carousel concept is really great for a Kelpie. I imagine that's how it's tricking its victims into riding it. Let me know if you think I should explore this idea more in the future. I'm really pleased with how all these details came together, especially since I'm not as used to working in a smaller scale. I think it looks super cool and spooky. I'm also happy and relieved to report that it did survive the shipping and is very loved in its new home. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. Make sure to boop that like button and subscribe for more projects.